Hi, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to today's IELTS lesson. My name is Melanie. I'm so happy to see you today. So today I'm going to take you through IELTS Speaking. Again, my name's Melanie. I am one of the founders of Bounce English, and I'm so happy you're here today. Welcome, and I hope you get some new tips that are going to help you. So let's talk about what we're going to do. In the next half hour, this should take about a half hour, somewhere between, I think, 20 minutes to a half hour. You're going to learn what's in the IELTS speaking test. You're going to learn what happens in each section. And you're also going to get some tips on how to maximize your score. So let's get to it, shall we? Hold on. Yeah, let's jump in. I am excited. I hope you are too. Hold on, I'm having some problems. So how is the IELTS speaking test organized? Well, let me tell you. First of all, it is 12 to 15 minutes long. There are 3 sections here. I'm just trying to put my little icon someplace where it's that annoying. Okay, there we go. There are 3 sections, and the IELTS speaking test is usually conducted at a different time than the rest of the test. So whenever you do the test, it's either going to be probably after you take the initial test, or it's going to happen before, maybe the day before, maybe a couple days before, maybe a day after the main exam, maybe in the afternoon, the same day, it depends, but it's always separate from the reading, listening, and writing. The reading, listening, and writing all take place kind of at the same time, and then this is separate. So that's how it's organized, and as I said, it's 12 to 15 minutes long, and there are 3 sections. Oh, hold on. So let's talk about part 1. Part 1 is 5 minutes, and the questions that you're going to get in part 1 are questions about pretty simple things. So daily habits, personal experiences, likes and dislikes. Because the questions are so simple, they're usually fairly easy to answer. Let's take a look at some potential questions for part 1. Part 1 topics include where you live, where you work. These are really typical questions for part 1. You may be asked about your hometown, things you think about your hometown, what you like, what you don't like, what there is to do in your hometown, what you recommend for visitors. These are all different types of questions you might get. You might be asked about free time activities, different things that you enjoy doing or maybe would do in your free time. So sports, things like that. You could be asked about daily routines. That's quite typical. So how you get to work or school, that's a really common type of question for IELTS. What your daily schedule is in terms of when you wake up, when you go to sleep, how much sleep you need or don't need, studying, where you study, why you study, what you like to study, things like that. And then you could also be asked questions about holidays, hobbies, leisure time activities. Again, very typical. So what you like to do on a day off, or what kinds of things you like to do in your free time as a hobby. So yeah, those are really typical part 1 questions. Here's some, so part 2 is a little bit longer. It lasts about 3 to 4 minutes, but the reason I say it's longer is because what happens in part 2 is that you are asked to speak for 1 to 2 minutes on a topic. And you have to try and speak without stopping. So that's kind of the trick with part 2. But you do get some time to prepare. And you also can take notes when you're preparing. And let me just tell you, I highly highly recommend that you use that minute. Sometimes students just sit there and don't do anything with it, which I don't understand. But what you need to do is really look at the question, think about it, and then try and like strategize your answer. Really make sure you've looked at the whole question is my advice. The topic is always about something that is related to your personal experience. So some example part 2 topics include things like a building you like. So, you know, maybe a building in your hometown or in your country or something like that. Memorable event, very typical part 2 question. Tell me about a holiday you remember or something like that. Tell me about a dinner you had that you liked or food that you cooked that you enjoyed, something like that. That's really typical. Or celebration that you went to. These are very typical part 2 questions. Could be a habit you do regularly. So like what's something you do to help you study better, or what's something you do to keep fit, but you have to talk about it. So in part 1, you might be asked that question and like you'll be asked a number of different questions related to that. In part 2, you'll be asked one, but you'll need to speak about it for a while. Or maybe a person you know, someone who's interesting to you, or a relative, or someone with someone who does something that you think is interesting. Like these are all typical, or it could even be something you want to try that you haven't tried, or something you want to do that you're planning on doing, you haven't done it yet. But all of these things, if you notice, they are personal things. And in general, you have the personal experience to answer the question in general. So now let's talk about part 3. Part 3 is about 4 to 5 minutes. The questions are more abstract. So what I mean by that is in part 1 and part 2, the questions are really personal. They're about you. But in part 3, it's not really so much about you anymore. It's about the wider world, society, country, people. It's more general. It's more abstract. But these questions are always related to part 2. So whatever you're asked in part 2, there's going to be a connection with part 3. So here are some examples of part 3 topics. So let's say in part 2, you were asked about a building you like. Maybe in part 3, you'll be asked about the benefits of preserving old buildings, or why people like to build new buildings, or how, I don't know, I don't want to speculate on questions I don't think you'll get, but this would be a very typical connection, connected to part 2 question. Part 3, if you were asked about a holiday that was important to you, you might be asked about how holidays have changed in recent years, or why do people celebrate holidays. See how part 2 is personal, and then part 3 is more wide, about the wider world. Maybe in part 2, you were asked about habits, something you do to keep healthy. And then in part 3, you're asked about how the government can encourage healthy habits. Or maybe in part 2, you were asked about food, some food you like. And then in part 3, you're asked about food and nutrition. You see, this again, wider world. Maybe in part 2, you were asked about someone who has a job that is interesting to you, or a job you've done that's interesting, or a job you want to do that's interesting. Then in part 3, you're asked about popular jobs in your country, or how do you think the job market will change? So again, wider world. These are pretty typical. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is a little bit about how the exam is scored. So what does the examiner look at to get your score? So first of all, you may know this already, but IELTS is marked on a band scale from 0, which means you booked the test but you didn't turn up, to 9, which is an expert user of English. Most people, in my experience, score somewhere between 4 and 8. But people do score lower and they do score higher. So just, I won't really get into it, but I will say like a 4, 5, even 6, you kind of, 4 is a little bit low, but 5, 6, 6.5, this is maybe an intermediate, medium level. And then anything like 7, 8, 8.5, 9, you're getting to a higher level of English. Anything below 4 is probably somebody whose English is really low. Personally, I feel like if you are in your first year of English study, like right at the beginning of English, you shouldn't be taking IELTS yet. You should wait. If you're watching this, you probably can't understand what I'm saying, so I don't know how helpful that is, but that's just my opinion. That's something to talk about for a different day. But anyway, IELTS is scored on a band scale of 0, which is the bottom, to 9, which is expert. I would say most people score between 4 and 8, 8.5. A score between like a 3.5, really 4. 4 to 5 is a lower score. Then you've got your 6, 7 that's kind of in the middle. 5 is also kind of a low middle score. And then anything that's like above a 7, you're getting into like higher English, just to kind of give you an idea. But there are different things that the examiner looks at when they're scoring your work, and these are what they are. The examiner actually looks at 4 different aspects of your speaking. They look at fluency, they look at vocabulary, they look at grammar, and they look at pronunciation. Let's talk about fluency. What we mean when we talk about fluency is the ability to keep going. So when the examiner asks you a question, let's say the examiner asks you, where do you live? Is your answer something like, I live in an apartment in the city center? This is not very fluent. Compare that to, I live in a house. There are actually 3 houses in the area where I live. It's a 1-bedroom house. I live there with my husband and a cat. So see how the second answer is a little bit more fluent. The second person is able to keep going. So problems, one of the reasons people have difficulty being fluent is because they don't know the words they want to use, or they need to stop to think about them. Maybe if you're someone who's translating from your first language to your second language, this is one of your issues. And then also, a little bit of fluency is just how organized your ideas are. Do they make sense when the person is speaking? Another thing the person looks at is vocabulary. So how much vocabulary can you use? When you're speaking, is your vocabulary range kind of wide, or is it more limited? If you don't know a word, is it possible for you to express the meaning anyway? So what I mean by that is sometimes we don't know the word in English, but we can think of ways to explain what we mean. So for example, my favorite room in the house is the room where I sleep. Maybe you can't remember the word bedroom, but if you say the room where I sleep, I know you mean bedroom. Is the vocabulary that you're using accurate? So you kind of get 2 points. I feel like you kind of get a yes and a yes for this. If you use the right term, even if you don't use it correctly. So let me explain a little bit better what I mean. So this also has to do with appropriacy. Is the language appropriate? So if I ask about, or if you are asked about, say, a birthday party or a memorable birthday, and you use words related to celebration, present, invite, guests, things like that, these words are appropriate. Maybe you make a mistake with one of them, but you know you need to use them. So as an examiner, I'm thinking to myself, they know they need to use this word, good, even if they make a mistake. So these are things that the examiner looks at when they look at vocabulary. And they look at very similar things when we're looking at grammar. So one thing that's looked at is just how much grammar you can use. So a student who's a lower level is probably not going to be able to use as many grammar structures, verb tenses, types of sentences correctly compared to a higher level student. Also, with grammar, we'll be listening for simple language. Sorry, I had an itch. I don't know if that's okay when you're doing these things. Are you using really simple sentences correctly? So, my name is Melanie. I live in California. These are very simple sentences. Can you use more complex grammar correctly? So, my name is Melanie and I live in California with my husband. See how that second sentence is a little bit more complex? So we'll be listening to that. We'll also be listening to types of grammar. So are you able to use different verb tenses? Are you able to use the passive? Are you able to use conditionals? I'm not getting into what all of those are today, but I think you get the point. And is the grammar that you're using appropriate for the topic? So if you're describing how something is made, then using the passive is great. But if you are just describing what you did last weekend, then using the passive isn't appropriate. So these are things that we'll be listening for. Then finally, of course, in a speaking test, you are going to be evaluated on your pronunciation, which I believe I spelled wrong in this slide. So, oh well. So what we'll be listening for are things like, are individual words spelled correctly? Or sorry, not spelled, pronounced. So even if there are some problems with pronunciation, can you still be understood? The key to pronunciation is actually just being clear. Are you clear with what you are saying? You know, if you're from China or you're from South Korea or from Brazil or wherever, what's wrong with sounding like you're from China or like you're from South Korea or Brazil? I say nothing. The key is, can you be understood? Okay, and so that just means clear pronunciation. It might mean tense. It might mean vowel sounds being pronounced accurately. But as long as what you're saying is clear, then you're fine. I will give you an example. Many years ago, I taught a student from a country that has problems with the I sound and the E sound. And he was very concerned that if he was asking for a sheet, oh, you can't really see it, I have a sheet of paper, that he would accidentally say shit of paper. And I said, I don't think that's going to happen because of the context. The context is still clear. So as I said, the key is clear word pronunciation. And are you able to use different features of pronunciation like stress, pausing, and intonation? I don't know if you've noticed, but as I've been talking to you, I have tried to use these features. I'm trying not to go too fast. I'm trying to pause when I think you need a minute to understand what I'm saying. And I'm also trying to go up and down with what I'm saying to help you follow along with what I'm telling you. These are all features of English speech, and you'll be evaluated on all of them. So now I thought it might be good for us to look at some examples. So I'm just going to play a little bit of two examples. I have one example of someone who's a band 4, and then I have someone who's a little bit higher. So we're going to listen to just a little bit of this, and then we're going to discuss, okay?
Well, we've been talking about interests and hobbies, and I'd like to discuss with you one or two more general questions related to this. So let's think about hobbies now and hobbies in the future. What are the most popular types of hobby in Korea now? What do most people like to do?
Many Koreans like to reading and talk about others. Yeah. And some person like to go to the movies.
Why do people like to do that kind of thing, reading and going to the movies?
I think Korean people like the public, gathering together, not alone.
So as we can see with this particular individual, she has a lot of pausing when she speaks. So her fluency is a little bit lower. And also what she can say is very limited. So her language is very simple. Korean people like gathering together. Her grammar is also very simple. She's able to make very simple sentences correctly, but she's not really able to say a lot. Her pronunciation, as we've seen it, is fairly clear. If we continue to watch this, it might become more difficult. So that is an example of a lower level student. Let's look at an example of a higher level student now. Maybe, if I can do this right. Oh no, okay, how about, there we go. So now I'm gonna play a little bit of someone who's a band 8, so much higher.
We've been talking about hobbies, and I'd like to discuss with you one or two more general questions related to this. Let's consider first of all current and future hobbies. What do you think are the most popular types of hobby in Germany?
For male Germans, it's probably football. And for females, it might be shopping. I don't know. It could be shopping. But many people are actually doing sports. So they would go jogging in their spare time.
Why do you think these hobbies are so popular?
Because I think you need balance in life. The working life is quite hard, and nowadays in Germany with the economic situation, etc., everybody needs an anchor point or a balance to their struggle during their working hours. So I guess just to have relaxation and to calm down and as a stress relief, I think sports is a good way to do so, and I think that's why many Germans are doing it.
So do you see how much more this person can say in the same amount of time? So much more language. Male Germans, they're able to use pronunciation and intonation to make jokes. They're able to describe hobbies and why people like these hobbies, and they're able to do all of that in 1 minute, and their grammar is actually pretty accurate. So I wanted to show you these so you could see the difference. These are easily available on YouTube. It's a great activity if you want to just listen to people at different band scores and kind of compare and see where you're at and evaluate them. I really recommend it. And now,
worldwide,
no,
the case.
We're done with this now. We're gonna move on, hopefully. Yeah. So now I want to give you some tips on how you can excel on the IELTS speaking exam. So here's a few suggestions for you. First of all, just relax. I know. Easier said than done. It's really hard to do when you have an exam and you want to do great. And, you know, I think that's a really common feeling, is to feel nervous in an exam. But honestly, the examiner probably wants you to do okay. They are not hoping to cause you problems. In fact, they're hoping that they can just have a conversation with you, and while that conversation is happening, they're going to evaluate you. That's it. So just relax and answer the questions as best you can. And that brings me to the second one. Give a real answer. You will have more to say if you're truly drawing on what you think and what you know about your own life, or mostly real. And what I mean by that is sometimes, I think it's rare, but sometimes the question that you're asked just isn't something that you really know a lot about or care a lot about. I mean, if someone asks you about your commute and you work from home, what are you going to really say about that? If someone asks you about your favorite book and you don't really read, What will you say about that? If someone asks you about your favorite sport and you don't care about sports, you might have to invent a few details, but honestly, that's fine. I mean, you know, the examiner is just evaluating your language. They don't really care what you say. I mean, they might have an opinion on it, but that's not the purpose of the exam. The purpose of the exam is to evaluate your speaking in relation to the questions you have been asked. So I say give a real answer. If you have to invent a detail or two, okay. In my experience, most of the time you will not have to do that at all. And that brings me to my third point, which is memorize vocabulary instead of answers. I think some students believe that they can memorize answers for the IELTS speaking test, but this is actually really hard because the IELTS speaking questions change all the time. So how can you memorize an answer for a question that you won't get? I mean, that's the truth, is that you probably won't even get this question that you've memorized. So instead of memorizing instead of memorizing an answer, memorize vocabulary. There are certain topics that always come up on the IELTS exam. They come up again and again and again. And so what you want to do is learn vocabulary related to those topics. The arts, environment, business, technology, sports, health. These types of questions repeatedly come up on the IELTS exam. So learn vocabulary related to those topics, and then practice questions related to those topics, and then the practice is going to help you answer those questions for real when you get them. A few more tips. Let the examiner stop you. The examiner's timing every interaction that you have, and you are expected to fill all of that time. So my advice to you is just keep talking. Just keep talking until the examiner tells you to stop. It's okay. There's no problem if the examiner tells you to stop at all. So my advice is try and say as much as you can. This is another reason why I tell you that when you do task 2, to use that minute to prepare. It's going to help you come up with more to say. Always better to have the examiner stop you than for both of you to sit there awkwardly because you ran out of things to say. It happens. It's not a big deal. If you don't understand a word, just ask. Just ask. It's fine. It's not going to cause a problem. It shouldn't cause any problem with your test. If you don't understand something, just go ahead and ask. Focus on expressing yourself. Just try and think about how you can say what you are trying to say. This is more important than worrying about any mistakes you might make. You know what? You're probably going to make mistakes. I've made mistakes in this talk with you, and I would call myself an expert not only in communication and language, but in this subject, and I've still made mistakes. Now, if I make mistakes, surely you will also make them. So don't worry if you make a mistake. Just keep going. If you can correct your mistake, like you realize you made the mistake, you want to correct it, do that. That's good. But the main focus should be on expressing yourself. So there you have it. That is the end of my short class today on IELTS speaking. We have all sorts of IELTS lessons that we can do for you at Bounce English and anything. So head on over to bounceenglish.rocks if you want to learn more. This is Melanie. I hope you tune in on Friday at 11 a.m. California time. We will be doing a conversation class, and I look forward to seeing you there. Okay? Have a great rest of your day. Bye.